So my warm welcome to the committee. I'm Adriana Di Stefano. I'm chairing this session as Dean of the class of Social Science and Humanities here at the Scuola Superiore di Catania. Thanks to Professor Laura Ingallinella, acting as relatrice of Myram this evening or this morning for you. And thanks also Professor to Marius Hauknes, Assistant Professor of Art History at the Medieval Institute of the University of Notre Dame, USA. Myram, you have a very international committee, should be proud of this high-level committee. My thanks also on behalf of our president, Professor Daniele Malfitana, and of my colleagues, Giuseppe Angilella, coordinator of the scientific class. I would just introduce Myram Rookshar. She has been a brilliant student at the Scuola Superiore di Catania. Happy to have here again, even virtually, Myram today. And she's going to present a tesi di licenza magistrale alla Scuola Superiore di Catania titled The Representation of Christ in Dante's Paradiso, Symbolism and Naturalism in Medieval Art in the Divine Comedy. So I would leave the screen to Professor Angilella for your introduction, and then you will present. Thank you.
Okay, so does everyone hear me? Okay, perfect. So first of all, I apologize in advance for my very nasal voice. I'm recovering from COVID, but I hope I will not be sort of like coughing around during my introduction, which is actually a lot of like a real pleasure. For many reasons. I'm not only an alumni of the Scuola Superiore di Catania, so this is my first return to the Scuola in a different, habit, as one would say, but it is also a pleasure to come to, as a supervisor, to this particular student, this particular Allieva, and with this particular thesis. I have to say that my relationship and my interaction with Rookshar has been one of the most felicitous products of the pandemic. We met virtually. Actually, we haven't had the pleasure yet to meet in person, but we met in 2020 during lockdown, as many activities were being done to sort of like bring communities together, and among academics with similar interests. And one of these was a mentoring opportunity fostered by the Scuola Superiore di Catania that brought together again alumni and current allievi with shared ideas, shared interests, shared scholarly endeavors. And that is how Rookshar and I came together. Our shared interest in Dante fostered so many conversations. At the time, Rookshar was writing her master's thesis with Professor Cristaldi at the University of Catania, and it is wonderful that from that sort of like baseline, from that groundwork, we can see her now move towards something adjacent, different, independent, but I would say that this thesis really represents a natural second step to what she has been building in her time at the University of Catania and the Scuola Superiore. In what regard? Rookshar's work has been always grounded in an interest in Paradiso, and more specifically the aesthetics of Paradiso, right? I remember our conversations during again that the mentoring process about her work on Beatrice. And that resulted actually shameless recommendation. Look for us in a Canto per Canto YouTube episode where we talked about Paradiso 32, just to give you a sense of like how Rookshar's interests were not only purely academic, but were already part of an international network of scholarship that produced this wonderful conversation that I had with her, and that is now available on YouTube. Again, moving on and building building onto these interests, we have this thesis that she's presenting today to the committee. Again, why am I saying that it's building upon previous work? It's again grounded in sort of like an interrogation of the aesthetic of Dante's Divine Comedy. And I'm saying that it builds upon previous work because it is like not only interdisciplinary in the way her previous work was, but it's building more onto this interdisciplinarity by looking at our history. And so bridging not only the intellectual and theological analysis of her previous interests into sort of like, I want to say the visual arts and the material world. So this thesis is, again, in its inception has a very simple yet elusive question. Why did Dante make a very specific choice about the representation of Christ? By even sort of like, listening to this question, one may think, how elusive, how complex, and yet how simple it is, right? But I think that speaks highly about Rookshar's like positioning within the field of Dante studies as a mature scholar. By asking the simple questions, one usually asks the more complicated ones, the most complex ones. And with the field of Dante studies, it is very, I think it is very common, I would say, to act as if everything has already been explained. We all know everything already about Dante. And then questions like these come up, and it's really interesting to see how asking a question about a choice that is obvious and yet unanswered may lead to novel interpretations. That is what I commend particularly about Rookshar's work. It's the interdisciplinarity, but also the novelty by which she, proposes a question that, again, may seem simple, and it's not simple at all. It's something that I really loved about her work, and I look forward to her presentation so she can show us some visual. I'm expecting some visual examples of that complexity. But I have to say, from what I've seen talking to her about this work, this is a first step. And I'm very much happy that this is a first step, in the sense that I cannot wait to see where this project leads. I cannot wait to see further deepening of these sort of like foregrounding question that she asks, and seeing where like the next step in asking this question may take her, again, in proposing something that I think Dante studies needs. Because if we think about the Divine Comedy, a journey towards God, the representation of one of the persons of the Trinity is like one of the most, again, central theoretical questions. So I'm very much glad that we're getting to talk about this. So Rookshar, I will leave you to your presentation, and thank you so much.
Meanwhile, thank you for the presentations, but also to all the members of the committee for being here. Okay, so today we'll talk about a particular aspect of the relationship between Dante and the iconography, which is, as Laura has anticipated, the representation of Christ, which has been, since its very beginning, characterized by an ambiguity, because in the Psalms he is described as the most beautiful child, while in Isaiah he is described as someone that possesses no beauty. So usually the beauty of Christ has been connected to his divinity, to representations that shows him in glory and in triumph, while the ugliness has usually been connected to his human life. So a life characterized by poverty, humility, and also shame for the death on the cross. And in these two traditions that are not to be considered in opposition, because there is a dialectic between them, Dante made a particular and very specific choice, which is rejecting the ugliness tradition. So there are very limited representation of Christ in the Divine Comedy, but there are no focuses on Christ's human life, but only glorious representations. So in this research, which is actually only a starting point, because it should become part of my PhD dissertation in the future. And I want to show how iconography can help us to understand why Dante made this choice in particular. Now, we have to say that the relationship between God and the image was changed by the incarnation, because we know that in Genesis it is told that man was created in the image and likeness of God. But this likeness was lost with the original sin committed by Adam and Eve. And but it was possible to recover the likeness thanks to incarnation. But incarnations means also that God assumed a physical image. So this is a turning point in relation to the Judaic ban of representing the divinity, because actually God assumed one. And this is in somewhat way very important for our research, but actually the Judaic ban influenced the Byzantine and the Western art for many centuries. Actually, in the early Christianism, we find only symbolic representation of the divinity, and not representations that want to have a naturalistic or realistic approach. For example, there is this representation of Christ as the Good Shepherd, which was a common iconography in the early centuries. And here it's true that it's a human figure, but it's actually symbolic, because we have a young man, and we know that Christ died in successive phase of life, so he should have the classical beard that we naturally associate to him. But in this case, youth is a symbol for immortality, and it was usually a trait of Hellenistic divinities. And in this case, it's a symbolic representation, because he is represented as a guide of the souls, who are here represented by the ships. And however, my focus is on a particular depiction of Christ, which is the Christus Triumphans. And it's and here there is already a change, because it's less symbolical than the previous one, because we have the representation of Christ as we usually know him. But at the same time, the cross is here as more as a symbol. It's called the triumphant Christ because he is represented in the moment he won over death, so in his divinity in particular, which is shown also by the fact that he does not suffer the pain of crucifixion, so his eyes are wide open, his expression is indifferent. And this type of image wanted the viewer to go beyond the image itself, which was only a means to reach another level of reality. So symbolism here prevails. And this was the most common iconography in the Middle Ages until the 13th century, when it was changed by the Christus Patiens, which instead focuses on the humanity of Christ. As a matter of fact, we find him here with the eyes closed, in pain for the sufferance he is bearing. And this type of representation in particular was promoted by the Franciscan environment, because St. Francis suggested a path of imitation of the life of Christ, the human life. And since here is represented the humanity, it wants to show the similarity between the divine and humankind, which allows also a mimesis, mimetic type of relationship, which is also affective. So there is an affective participation, and in the Middle Ages, the affective participation must be considered as a means of knowledge. So also on a gnoseological level, which so it is a way of knowing God in according to a medieval mind. And this type of representation influenced in particular the Franciscan environment, which is the one that actually was the protagonist for the rise of naturalism in the 13th century, which is usually connected to names, famous names like Cimabue and Giotto, and that actually promoted then the more naturalistic and realistic approach of the Renaissance art. And an example of Giotto's art is the reception of the Stigmata by St. Francis. That was that had a huge resonance because Francis was the first to receive the Stigmata. So of course, in the iconography of the Franciscan environment, this episode usually has a great importance in the cycle of the life of St. Francis. And here we can see that already naturalism is affirming itself as a realistic representation of reality. So, for example, there is a three-dimensional effect for the shadows and the fact that we can see in the interiors of the buildings. But naturalism and symbolism do not have to be seen in opposition, but more in a dialectical relationship. Because, for example, here we find the rays that are coming from the Christ and are reaching St. Francis to impress the stigmata on his body. So there is a physical transformation of St. Francis, but that is also spiritual, and also the golden color of the rays is actually suggests a symbolical meaning of this rays as well. This is fundamentally the artistic context and the changes that were happening in Dante's age, because the Christus Patiens became the major form of representation actually in the years Dante was alive, and he was perfectly aware of these changes. He acknowledged Giotto as his most as the most important painter of the time. And in a certain way, Dante is a naturalist artist as well, because he has been widely acknowledged as a realist. And everyone who has read a bit the Divine Comedy knows that, for example, his characters are well developed from a psychological point of view, and that his free reigns, hell, purgatory, and heaven are perfectly mapped. And to his realism contribute also the fact that he is testifying what he has seen. So there is a wide contribution of naturalism in the Divine Comedy, but especially in Inferno and Purgatorio, and not in Paradiso, which relies more on symbolical form of representation. But this difference is only an apparent opposition in relation to the first two canticas, because as we will see, symbolism is paradoxically the most realistic way of depicting heaven. And there are few representations of Christ, and the most significant one is in Paradiso 23, which I'm going to analyze very briefly. In this passage, in this canto, Beatrice is leading Dante toward the heaven of the fixed stars, and they assist to the triumph of Christ and Mary. And actually, he used the word triumph, which could lead also to maybe suggest the idea of the classical triumph of the generals, but the rest of the description actually does not support this interpretation, because there are no other references to the military vocabulary. It must be then intended as a triumph in the Christian sense, and we have seen that for example, in the Christus Triumphans, it's usually related to the representation of divinity. And how Dante depicts divinity in this canto, usually by symbol like the sun, or by abstract concepts. In this case, there is the expression the illuminating substance, but then we can find also virtù, wisdom, power, and again virtue. Actually, abstractions is symbolical form of representation. It's not obviously a direct one. So Dante is denying a naturalistic approach for Christ. But as we have seen, the symbolic representation in Dante's age is functional to represent the divinity. But since Dante's realism was kind of a huge original trait of his poetry, it would be unlikely that he would abandon realism to go back to a more conservative figurative mode. So we have to interpret the symbolism as a new form of realism in a way that suggests the divine. But that also is important because the point of Dante's Paradise is not simply describing the afterlife. As he points at the very beginning of this canticle, in the first canto, he says that the point of this journey in paradise is transhumanizing, so going beyond the human in a way that also the Christus Triumphans wanted to suggest to the viewer, which is important also on for Dante's Poetics, because he doesn't want to make the divinity closer to the human. In this case, he is going to God. So there is a transformation of the human being that he wants to suggest, and in this way, his writing can also how can I say, emerge from the rest and imitating the Bible itself, which was considered a theophany, a manifestation of God himself, and this is the model that Dante is trying to pursue.